In a previous presentation, you recommended the X-Rite i1 Studio mid-level color calibrator. Could you repeat why this is slightly lesser priced accessory? Is it better value or more adequate for most doing their own printing?
Yeah, so the biggest difference between the i1 Studio and the i1, I think Display Pro, they call it now, or that's what they used to call it, is that the i1 Studio is great for any normal monitor, laptop, that sort of thing. The step up, the Display Pro, you have to use if you have a 10-bit display or a 99% Adobe RGB photography monitor or something like that. Any display with a hardware LUT, you have to use the Display Pro. But for any other standard monitor, the i1 Studio is just fine. And they do the same measurements, you get the same profile, so there's no benefit for, say, a laptop of spending the extra money for the Display Pro. But that's really the big difference between the two of them.
Great. So Lisa's asking, I want to print with Lasal Photo Matte. Unfortunately, her prints end up with the paper becoming wavy. Is there too much ink on it? She's using the Epson P800, and she doesn't have any issues with other papers. So what can you, and she also lives in a dry climate. So can you help out with what's happening?
Yeah, so the dry climate may be the key to this. It's something we get a lot of questions about, especially in the winter. I spoke with someone the other week in Minnesota whose humidity was 4%. Ideally, we want to print around 50%, even down to 40, you shouldn't have any issues. If you're below that, the challenge is that the paper is so dry that when the ink hits it, it absorbs most of that liquid in the ink instead of just capturing it in that receiver layer. So I'm curious if you were to increase the humidity, if possible, up to 40% if you can. 50 is optimal, but 50 is a lot if you live in a really dry place. That might make a difference. And again, it's going to be more sensitive on matte papers because there's less coating to kind of stabilize that sheet in low humidity. So that would be definitely the first thing to check and see. And for all those of you out there who are printing in maybe the Northeast or the Midwest in winter, if you have a smaller office studio space and you can get a hygrometer to measure your humidity, keep an eye on that because it can prevent a lot of printing challenges. If you can, say the day you want to print, humidify the room in the morning and then keep it constant all day so that the paper has some time to acclimate and everything's really dialed in for that printing that you're going to do.
I have trouble loading the Juniper Baryta paper in the Epson P5000 in the regular feeder. Should they be using the front feeder?
Yeah, so the Juniper is a pretty thick and stiff cotton paper. It's not really designed for the cassette in the P5000. You're definitely better off using the single sheet feeder, or if you want to do bigger prints, I was going to say, I don't think we offer that in a 17-inch roll right now, so that's not going to help you. But yes, the answer is either a few sheets in the cassette, maybe 5 or 10 at the most. But even so, I know on ours, sometimes it has trouble making that U-turn as it pulls it out of the cassette to print on it. So the single sheet feeder or the manual feed will be bulletproof with every print you're going to make.
Should you use buffered or unbuffered interleaving tissue for the Juniper paper?
You can use either one. That is not going to be a big deal because the paper itself is pH neutral and acid free. So you don't necessarily need a buffered interleaving sheet because you're not introducing anything else into that mix that's going to need to be absorbed. The biggest thing about after printing is if you can let it off gas for, optimally overnight is the best. If you're making a lot of prints and you have a small amount of space, 30 minutes to an hour gets most of the liquids to evaporate. But you don't want to print it and then immediately put it in a stack or interleave it or whatever else. Do give it some time to off gas if at all possible.
Which Moab papers are archival?
So all of the Moab papers are made to archival standards, meaning they're pH neutral, acid free, lignin free, and designed for longevity. The assumption about all these papers is that the 100% cotton papers will last the longest, and that's mainly because we've been making paper with cotton for hundreds of years. So there's good background on that. We've been making paper with tree pulp for just as long, but probably without some of the manufacturing processes that we use now. So all the Moab papers are archival. The longest, the expected to last the longest are the cotton base. And then when you combine that with the inks, it's the cotton rag. So the Entrada, the Somerset Museum rag, the Juniper Baryta, those will be likely your longest ones, but we're talking, you know, possible degradation long after all of us are gone. So in the short term, anything is gonna last and be just fine. The biggest determination when you're making a print for archivability is whether you use dye or pigment inks. Pigment inks have actual physical particles of color in them, so they're much more archival than dye inks, which are just colored liquid designed more for glossy papers.
When printing on canvas, what sort of spray coatings are available to protect the canvas? And we have a ton of questions about like sprays that you can use on paper. So I'm going to kind of ask some of those all in one.
Yeah, and I'm going to jump in. Karen Stern, I know you've got a couple of questions. I did receive your email, so I'm going to get back to you directly on that because it's more of a specific problem. So I do see you. We haven't forgotten about you, but I will email you back later today. So canvas coatings, the biggest thing when you're using anything that you're going to coat with inkjet, canvas, matte paper, that sort of thing, is you have to make sure that you use an inkjet compatible coating. There are a lot of art coatings out there that are not designed for inkjet, and especially the ones designed for oil paints and things like that will often have thinners or solvents in them, which can dissolve inkjet inks or do some damage to the paper coating or lots of other things. So number one, make sure you're using an aqueous inkjet compatible coating. Desert Varnish is the product that we make, and that's in an aerosol form, generally intended for kind of smaller pieces. Doing a 36 by 48 canvas with that is going to be a bit of a challenge. You can, but it's going to take some time. There are many roll-on or airbrush applied kind of bulk coatings that framers or canvas printers use. Premier Art is a company that people have recommended to us. There's another one that someone emailed about a couple of weeks ago. I don't remember what it is off the top of my head, but you know, call up your local photo store or art supply store and ask if they have recommendations or if they stock something. It's always nice when you can talk to somebody about this coating or that coating. What are the pros or the cons? Also keep in mind that a lot of canvas coatings will come in a matte, a semi-gloss, and a glossy option. So if you have a matte canvas and you want to keep it that way, or if you have a matte canvas and you want to add some surface shine to it, you can do that with different coatings as well. So bottom of the line, make sure that it's an aqueous inkjet compatible coating, and then kind of ask around and see what people recommend. And
then is there a cure time needed before framing or putting your print under glass?
Yeah, so we call that off-gassing. What has to happen is after you print, the liquids in the inks need to evaporate out of the surface of the sheet. And most of that evaporation happens in the first hour or so. But before framing, I always like to let a print off-gas at least 8 to 12 hours overnight. If you print it and frame it immediately, you're not going to damage the print, but you'll notice over the first couple of weeks, the glass will start to fog up because all those liquids are evaporating off the paper and they have to condense somewhere. So let it dry, let it off gas at least overnight, and then you're good to put it in an archival box for storage, or to frame it, or to coat it, or laminate it, or whatever you're intending to do with the final print.
And then someone's asking about using this on the Moab Kopi Unryu paper. Can you use the Desert Varnish on that?
Absolutely. You can use the Desert Varnish on any of the matte papers that we have. And some folks ask about glossy, luster, Baryta. The varnish is not designed for those. So sometimes people have used it with mixed results. You're not going to damage the print, but there's a good chance on a coated paper, glossy paper, that the varnish is not going to be absorbed and it's going to kind of beat up on the surface. So just make sure you want to use that for the cotton rags, the matte papers, the Moab Kopi papers.
So someone is actually new in printing. They don't have much experience, but they do want to get started. So they're looking to for primarily prints for their home and to just enter a camera club competition. So the 13 by 19 is the largest that they need. What type of printer would you recommend?
So there are a few printers out there in the 13x19 space. What do we have? So we have, and we're talking photo specific printers here. Obviously you can go to the office supply store and get all sorts of things, but for a photo printer, Canon just released the Pixma Pro 200. That does up to 13x19. We've done profiles for that. That's a great printer, great option, great color, big improvement over the Pro 100 in image quality, both color and black and white. In dye, Epson has the XP 15000, also great, great color prints. The XP 15000 to me has kind of an ink hog, so I think the Canon is probably more economical for ink in the long run. And then if you go to Pigment Ink, and I would recommend if you really love matte and cotton rag papers, get a Pigment Ink printer instead of a dye printer, because Pigment Ink will always print better on matte paper. So for Pigment Ink, you're looking at the Canon Pro 300, which was also newly released, I think, in the fall, or the Epson P700. Both of those do a great job. Great media handling, good gamut, good color. Kind of depends on if you like the Canon software for printing or if you've always used Epson printers. Granted, if you're saying that they're new to the printing game, then I think that I would say at this point, I would get that Canon Pro 300. I think it has a lower cost of ownership, and Canon has great tech support based on the East Coast of the US. So if you have problems with it, you can call in and talk to somebody that has had hands-on experience with the printer and should be pretty able to walk you through any technical questions you have on their products.
With Canon Pro 1000, there's an option called Avoid Paper Abrasion. Is it really useful, or is it better to simply change the base paper setting to one with higher print head clearance?
So you don't want to change the base paper setting if you're using one of our profiles, because you'll change the color. So Avoid Paper Abrasion is great for thicker papers where you need that. I know on our Pro 1000, I use Avoid Abrasion for the Slick Rock Silver 300 and the Juniper Baryta 305. And again, you may need it, you may not need it. There's no harm in enabling it for those papers. If you have it turned on and you're printing on a thin paper, like the Slick Rock Pearl or the Moen Copy, you might see some banding because the printer is expecting it to be, sort of thicker than the media setting specifies. So no harm in enabling that for thicker sheets, no detriment to quality or anything else. And again, the Slick Rock Silver and the Juniper are the two papers that I use it for when printing samples here on our Pro 1000.
Most of the profiles say to use the quality setting of 144 dpi. Is there a problem using a higher setting?
No, and I think we've taken the resolution guidance out of our documentation. No, you can print at any resolution that you prefer. When we create profiles, I make them with sort of the default resolution for that media setting, just because most people aren't going to go in and change it. So, but any differences changed by the number of printhead passes are extremely minor in terms of how the print looks. And the biggest time that upping your resolution is going to matter is if you're printing 16-bit files on larger prints, because you will get a little more detail. So above 13x19, when you get into your 16x20, 20x24, those prints are going to really benefit from, or can really benefit, depending on your file, from a 16-bit image and the higher print DPI.
The Entrada rag tends to curl a lot. What is the best way to straighten a print from roll so that it can eventually be mounted on a board?
So the best way to straighten a print is to back roll it. So I'm trying to think, I think I have a little, I'm going to pop off for just a second and find a tool for that. All right, I can't find the tube that I set up for back rolling. And there's a product created by IT Supplies that is specifically, they call it the D-roller, and it's specifically made for flattening out rolled prints after printing. But what I kind of made, and this is a crude idea of it because I found a roll of bubble wrap to show you. But what it is you take a large diameter tube, it can be an old paper core or anything like that, and then you can wrap it in say, a sheet of matte paper so that it protects your print from the cardboard, because cardboard is not archival or anything else like that. But then if you have a print that's curled, you can take it and roll it. You know, so if it comes off the printer and it's curled like this, you can set it in and roll it up in that tube, hold it for 10, 20, 30 seconds, and then release it, and it should lay a lot flatter. And something like the Entrada, the 300 weight that's coated on both sides, that's going to have a little more of a memory than the 290 that's only coated on one side. And then what you can do with this, if you're building one of these yourself, is take a large sheet of paper and kind of tape it perpendicular to the tube, so that once that's taped on there, you have a guide to set your print in, and then it holds it as it rolls it up. So if you want to make your own, that's what I would recommend. Or again, IT Supplies sells that D-roller. I think it's a couple $100 for the 24-inch one, but if you're doing a lot of roll printing, it's kind of invaluable to flatten out those prints and get them easier to frame or easier to store if you're storing them flat.
I have a problem with Canon Print Studio Pro on a Canon Pro 10 printer when I use Entrada Rag Natural. Moab recommends the setting, media type setting for Entrada to other fine art paper.
Fine art paper one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's something that I'm working on. If we haven't posted them yet, I need to get 2 profiles up there, one that uses matte photo paper and one that uses other fine art paper one. We used other fine art paper one for the profiling because it does give you a noticeably deeper black and a little more shadow detail, but it requires the use of, they call it art margin 30. So if you're in there and you're choosing your paper size, say you're printing on 8.5/11, then there's a little sub menu that says, US letter borderless, US letter art margin 30, or something else. And so if you choose the art margin 30, then it will let you use other fine art as the media setting. But the trade-off is you have mandatory 1-inch margins. So if you're trying to make an 8x10, you're going to have to use an 11x14 or 11x17 sheet minimum. Now, what you can do is you can actually use the other fine art profile with matte photo paper as the media setting. Your colors will be almost identical, but again, you won't get quite as dark a black. So that's the trade-off, but also the workaround for that. The nice thing is on the new ones, the Canon Pro 300 and the Pro 1000, they've eliminated that really aggressive margin requirement. So you can print on those fine art papers up to the edge or borderless without having to have those margin restrictions. So that's a nice upgrade. They took all their customer feedback and made it happen.
I like to print panorama images at a size of 12x36. My printer, Canon Pro 300, will handle a 13x39 paper, but he's having trouble finding a paper of that size or even a 13-inch roll. Any suggestions?
Yeah, we don't offer a lot in 13-inch rolls. We did a while back, but they hardly ever sold. So they were, retailers didn't really want to stock them. So what I would say is if you have a Moab paper that you love, you could get a 24 or a 36-inch roll and then cut, long strips, the width of the roll off of that. So if you have something like a Rototrim paper cutter or some other rotary trimmer, you can feed the paper in and cut 12-inch by whatever, or 13-inch or 8, whatever you're looking for panoramas. But with a printer like that that's not a big printer that takes roll paper, your best bet is probably to get a roll and then cut sheets out of it. And then you'll want to back roll them before you load them in the printer. So you probably want to either get that D-roller or make up some kind of tool of your own to flatten that paper out, because it's going to make it a lot easier to feed it if you take some of that curl out of it. But yeah, unfortunately, those sheet panoramas on the smaller printers it's a bit of a challenge to get the paper. But again, if you have a paper that you love, you can spend an afternoon cutting a bunch of sheets out of it, and then you'll be all set when you want to print those panoramas.
I have duplicate ICC profiles in my Lightroom. Is there a way to delete the duplicates?
Well, the first thing you can do in Lightroom is you can just unselect them. So let's switch over to Lightroom quickly. And that's Photoshop. It's always good when the technical presenter picks the wrong thing to share. Let's try again. All right, we're looking for Lightroom Classic. There it is. And we're going to go to the print module, which hopefully you can all see. So if you scroll down to color management and you go to the profile menu and you go to the bottom where it says other, where you would add a profile, you can go in and anything that's checked, and let's say you have, for instance, these two profiles and you only want one of them, you can just unselect the one and hit OK, and then it will be removed from your list. So you haven't deleted it from the printer, sorry, from the computer, but you've removed it from the list so you won't see it in Lightroom. If you want to completely remove it from the computer, then you'll need to go to the profiles folder and actually physically delete it. But if you just want to remove it from the Lightroom menu, all you have to do is go to the profile menu, other, and then unselect the ones that you want to get rid of.
Where can someone find the AdobeRGB?
So AdobeRGB we use as the color space for your files when you're editing. So if you're shooting JPEG, that is a setting in your camera. If you're shooting RAW files, that's a setting in your RAW converter. So if you're using Adobe Camera Raw in Photoshop, or if you're in Lightroom, it's in the preferences. So it kind of depends on what your workflow is for your files. AdobeRGB is not something you use as an output profile when you print, but it's a color space that you work in when you're editing your images. So I think that's kind of a half answer, but I'm not sure the rest of that question.
What hardware and software do you use to make your paper profiles?
So we use a mix of things, kind of depending on the paper. Right now we're using X-Rite's hardware, so the automated scanner, the ISIS 2, and then the Pro 3 and the Pro 3 Plus on an IO table. And then the data is run either through a partner of ours for profile creation or through basic color software, or sometimes through the X-Rite software. So it all depends on what the paper is, what the patch target needs to be, that sort of thing. It's a ever evolving process of figuring out what makes the most accurate and best rendered profiles.
Do you generate a new custom printer profile when you receive a new box of sheet paper or roll paper? Is it necessary?
It shouldn't be necessary. All this paper is created, you know, the base media is the same, the coding recipe is the same, the machines used are the same. And often, you know, a paper is made in master rolls. So typically they're 50 or 60 inches wide by a couple thousand feet. So you could buy a number of different boxes or rolls from a vendor, and they've actually all come out of the same master roll. So I haven't done any custom profiling on different print runs, mainly because if there are any differences, they would be probably not even visible to the human eye. We might be able to measure that they were slightly different, but it's not a distinction that you would see. So the biggest thing that people do secondary custom profiles for are to match the lighting conditions in a specific display space. That can do a lot more to influence how the print looks. So if you're going to have a gallery show, you can usually go in and measure the temperature of the lighting in the gallery and the color, and then you can build a profile based off of those measurements just for the prints that will display for that show. And then if someone buys a print from the show, they don't actually buy the print off the wall. They buy another copy of it that is printed with a neutral profile that's lighting independent. But that's really the one time that you would do a one-off custom profile for a specific purpose.
So we have a botanical artist using craft paper with watercolor and colored pencils.
Mm-hmm.
What is a good starter printer for small copies, and what is the best paper for replicating craft quality?
Yeah, so if you're an artist doing that process, you're absolutely using probably lightly textured or smooth finish, you know, cotton papers or maybe hot press papers. So you're going to want to reproduce those drawings generally on a similar media. So I would say a pigment ink printer is going to give you the best prints on cotton rag or matte papers. And then when you digitize that artwork, the process captures a lot of the texture in the original paper. So for instance, for people doing watercolors on maybe a cold press paper that's got a lot of texture, that texture will come through in the digitized file. So I actually recommend that you print on a less textured paper than what you're using for the artwork, because it will keep that texture feeling more true to the original. If you, for instance, digitize a watercolor and then print it on a really aggressively textured cotton paper, you'll kind of double the apparent texture in the paper and maybe override the way the original looked. So what I would recommend is, if you're looking at the Moab, the Entrada rag or the Entrada textured or the Somerset Museum rag, get our sample box. It's 2 sheets of each paper, and print one of your drawings on, print the same drawing on 4 or 5 different papers, and see how the paper influences that print and what's aesthetically closest to the original, and then use that as a basis for choosing what you're going to use for artwork reproduction.
And we also actually work with a botanical artist using our Stonehenge craft paper, and she does prints and makes it look exactly the same. So if you want to email us, feel free, and we can get you the answer and see what she does as well. And since you were talking about sample packs, someone receives a sample pack of ours, which, like you mentioned, has 2 sheets of each paper. They downloaded all the profiles. What is the best way to evaluate them to choose the right paper to invest in for future printing?
Yeah, so number one, when you're printing on the sample box, don't pick a different image for each paper, because your goal is to see how the paper changes the perception of the image. Now, if all your settings are right and you're using our profiles, those prints should come out very similar in color. So the blues in the sky on the Juniper should pretty much match the blues on the sky in the Entrada. Obviously, different papers do have different gamuts, so it might vary a little bit, but they'll be really close. So what you're looking for in evaluating those papers is, how does the paper change the perception of the image? Kind of the biggest thing being a glossy paper or a photo black paper is going to have more apparent contrast. Here's a good setup than a matte paper. So if we look at these two, they're pretty similar. Obviously, you can see which one is the Juniper Baryta. It will have some reflection to it, whereas the Entrada on top is a total matte paper. But you can kind of see on the bottom here that the lower paper is a little darker. In person, it looks just a little richer, whereas the paper on top is the cotton rag, so it's going to be a little lighter in the shadows. And that's mainly because a photo black paper, a glossy-ish reflective paper, actually reflects more light back to the viewer than the matte paper does. So that's your jumping off point for glossy versus matte, or photo black versus matte black. But what you're really looking for is, what is the aesthetic of the image? So this image looks great on both papers. On the Juniper, it's got a nice richness. It's very photorealistic. You have that really nice detail that's retained down here. But on the matte paper, we still keep that detail. It's not quite as dense, and we still keep those nice colors. And for this image, I actually prefer the matte paper, because to me, it matches the subtlety of the morning, the fog, the clouds. We keep nice definition on the mountain ridge, but it was a softer morning. It had a softer feel to it. So to me, the matte paper is the clear choice for this print. So what you're going to do when you're assessing that sample box is, you're going to take an image that you really love. And it's also good if it's an image with a wide contrast range and some shadow detail and something that's maybe a little more challenging to the print. And then when you run that on 4 or 5 different papers, it will immediately pop out to you. Is it a warmer tone paper? Is it a brighter white paper? How's the shadow detail? How's the overall gamut? And then let those prints off gas dry for at least an hour, because the image will change a little bit as the paper dries, it'll become generally more true to screen as those inks off gas. And then evaluate those prints under a good light source and see what jumps out at you. And the goal, especially when you're just starting out or when you're trying new papers, is, you're going to have 3, maybe 4 papers that are in your print quiver, so to speak. And those are your go-to papers. You don't have to be familiar with 6 or 8 or 10 or the whole line or anything else like that. You're going to pick 3 or 4 that are your daily go-to papers. And then maybe a year from now, you're going to say, gosh, I love these 3, this 4th one, I'm ready for something new. And then you can actually go revisit those sample prints that you made from the sample box and look back at the image and say, gosh, I didn't notice the aesthetic in this paper, or I really like a little texture, so I'm going to use the Entrada rag textured. So keep those prints you make from the sample box and refer back to them later so that you can maybe address a specific project for something new or anything like that. But the key is to print the same image on a lot of papers to directly compare them.
When should someone start soft proofing? Should it be early in the process to get the image where they want it, or make minor adjustments at the end?
So generally, or most of the time, soft proofing is done at the very end, because what you're doing in a soft proof is AdobeRGB and ProPhotoRGB color spaces that we edit in have a lot more color possibilities in them than what we can print. And I'm going to see if I can pull up a graphic of that real quick. So what happens when we go to print is the rendering intent takes the color data in our file, and if necessary, adapts those out of gamut colors, maps them back into the printable space. So what your soft proof is doing is your soft proof is showing you if there are any out of gamut colors, and it can identify what those are. And then it's going to show you how those will get translated in the final print. So let's see, here's a kind of a better explanation of it. So this is, as I was mentioning, the wireframe is the AdobeRGB color space. And the solid in the middle is the profile for Juniper Baryta rag on the Epson P5000. So it's our widest gamut paper on one of the widest gamut printers out there in the market. So you can still see that there's a lot of green, a lot of blue, purple, and red that we can't print one-to-one. And what's interesting about this is there are some blues and some yellows that we can print that actually aren't even in that color space. So what soft proof can do is the original image on the left. When you soft proof on the right, you can turn on gamut warning, and that will show you, highlight exactly what colors will get changed. And then you can see, well, is that a problem that I want to address in my editing? Or am I happy with the result of that rendering intent and how it's going to print those out of gamut colors? So rarely should you need to make edits based on the soft proof, and you absolutely don't want to edit to try and get everything back in gamut, because that rendering intent and the profile are going to do typically a better job of bringing those few colors back into gamut than we could do editing, because instead of addressing this overall saturation of the image, the rendering intent is just going to edit those few colors. So I'm going to jump into it already here. Soft proofing in Photoshop is the View Proof Setup menu for those of you who haven't done it. So View Proof Setup Custom. And then the little window that pops up, Device to Simulate, is what you're going to select as your output profile. And then again, your rendering intent. So Relative Color Metric takes the out of gamut colors and moves them right to the edge of the printable space and leaves the in gamut colors alone. Perceptual rendering adjusts the entire image a little bit to keep the color relationships the same. So generally, if you have a large percentage of out of gamut colors, perceptual will give you the better print. If you have a smaller number of out of gamut colors, relative color metric is going to give you the most screen accurate print because it's not changing in gamut colors at all. Lightroom has the same ability. You can check the box for soft proofing in the develop module. And then the other thing to keep in mind is your printed gamut is going to change based on the paper and the printer. So for instance, Juniper on the P5000 versus Trada on the Pro 10, we've changed both the paper and the ink set. So there's no hard and fast rule for this paper on that printer or anything else. You're going to let the rendering intent do the heavy lifting when you go to print, and the soft proof is just kind of a verification of how is it going to print and what might get translated because it's out of gamut.
I have an Epson P700. Is there any advantage using Epson print layout versus Lightroom print module?
I have not used the Epson print layout software yet, so I don't know.
Which Moab paper would substitute for Ilford Gold Fiber Silk?
Gold fiber silk. I believe that is the Juniper Baryta, which might be slightly warmer. Might be a slightly warmer white than the gold fiber silk. I don't remember, but it's going to be a pretty close substitute.
Yeah, I believe our Juniper is a more of an off-white than any other Baryta paper. Someone's never tried Moab paper. I know that we suggest the sample box usually, but if someone did not want to go to the sample box right away, is there another paper that you would suggest for a beginner?
Well, let's see. It depends on if you prefer matte or cotton rag papers or luster Baryta paper. It's not the cheapest paper we make, but I think Juniper is a fantastic all-around starter paper. It's a photo black paper, so you get that richness and that more photorealistic look. It's going to give you a much more interesting print, I think, than you would get, say, on the luster, which is just a bright white classic luster, whereas the Juniper is that warmer white cotton, has some kind of personality in the coating. So I would say the Juniper Baryta is a great one. And then if you are more of a matte paper cotton rag aficionado, I would go for the Entrada 190, either the bright or the natural. If you're looking for something that's going to be the most kind of predictable to what you're used to, you probably want to go with the Rag Bright, because that's going to be a brighter white base. So I guess my recommendation would be either the Juniper Baryta or the Entrada Rag Bright 190.
When would you suggest using 8-bit versus 16-bit?
If you shot the image in RAW, then you have access to 16-bit. Keep in mind, if you're shooting in JPEG or something like that, even if you turn it into a 16-bit file, you're not changing anything. You're putting, a small cup of coffee in a big cup, but you're not filling up that extra space because the colors were set in the camera. So if you're editing RAW, 16-bit, if it fits into your workflow, there's no harm in using 16-bit all the time. It does create larger files and it limits some of the filters and other things you can use in Photoshop. The big advantage to 16-bit is the available shades of gray and the tonality you can achieve in an image. Now, in a 5x7 or 8x10 print, you'll probably see very little of this, but especially if you're printing larger, again, in the 1624 or larger than that, a 16-bit should give you a much smoother file with more finely tuned gradations, because an 8-bit file has 256 available shades of gray, and a 16-bit, I think, has 63,000 and change shades of gray. So it's a huge jump in the tonality of the file, but there are a few trade-offs. So no reason not to do it if it doesn't interrupt your workflow or if it doesn't take away tools that you use in Photoshop. But again, the big advantage is on the larger prints.
Is there a disadvantage in setting 300 DPI?
No, some people still swear by, and and this gets back for a little context. It was often said in the past that your best print came off an Epson if you sized your image to 360 pixels an inch, and looked best off the Canon if you sized it to 300 pixels an inch. Now, there are still photographers that I've talked to that swear that they see a difference in this. So whether they downres or upres the file to achieve that pixels per inch at their specific print size, I haven't been able to see that. So for me, I send the printer the best file that I've got. So if I'm printing a 12 by 18 and it's a high res original and it's at 800 pixels per inch at that size, I send all that data to the printer because our software and our processors are fast enough that the software can do the math to adapt those pixels to what the printer needs to output. And I figure software that's been designed by the printer manufacturer is probably going to do a much better job determining what pixels to keep and what pixels to not use versus me randomly upsizing or downsizing an image to get to an arbitrary number. So I think 10 or 15 years ago, it made a big difference because we didn't have the hardware speed to handle that. But I think now it's not really important. Again, some people will disagree with me, but for all the prints that I've made, I've not ever seen an improvement by sending the printer a specific pixels per inch in the file.
I have Juniper Baryta rag and Somerset Museum rag and can't get my printer to use the 300 GSM paper. Can you recommend printers that will allow me to print these weights?
It'd be helpful to know what printer the person has now, but any photo printer out there should have no trouble printing those weights. You might have to use the manual feed if it's a Canon or the front feed if it's an Epson to make sure that that paper feeds at first, because a lot of the problem with these papers is when you load it in the sheet feeder, if it's a really stiff sheet, it has to grab it and then get it around that corner to start printing on it. And a really stiff sheet, often it can't get it to make that first corner.
And it looks like they're using the Canon Pixma.
All right. Yeah, so I would say, any photo printer out there, granted, if you're using the museum rag, you're again going to be better off with Pigment Ink. If you live near a camera store, go in and demo the printers that they have and give it a try and see what the output is. That's one of the greatest things if you're fortunate enough to still have a camera store, in your area. That's exactly what they're there for. Go in, make some test prints, run some paper through, talk to the person that handles their printers, and then walk out of the store with the one that fits your needs. But generally, any current photo printer should have no trouble handling those two papers.
So Stephen has a calibrated monitor and uses soft proofing on his images with the correct ICC profile. However, there's obviously dependency on the light source when evaluating some, not all prints relative to the image on his computer. Mm-hmm. I use daylight balanced LED bulbs with a high CRI to view these prints. Is there a standard light source that should be used? How many lumens at what distance? Not sure if I said that right.
Yeah, I mean, if you really want to get technical with evaluating your prints, what you're going to want is a viewing booth or a viewing box. GTI makes them. X-Rite has one or two, and those give you the option of exactly the correct brightness. You can do daylight, you can do soft white, you can do it with or without UV. You're looking at $700 to $1,000 for the smallest sort of desktop size. But if you want a really calibrated viewing environment, there's no better way to do it than that. And that's going to give you all of the available options for evaluating those prints. Now with a high CRI, high quality LED, either daylight or warmer white, depending on how your prints are going to be displayed or exactly what you're looking for, you're already at kind of the best you can do in a standard lighting environment. The step up would definitely be going to one of those small viewing booths, desktop viewing booths.
Which Moab matte paper has the best Dmax, and is there any way to increase this through a printing software?
Yeah, so Dmax is one of those things that is, I think, often written about, and it was a big deal for darkroom papers. I think Dmax is a little less useful as a term now because it's a ratio of how black the paper can get. And I know printers printer manufacturers get all excited when they release a new model and they say, oh, the Dmax is now 2.4 or whatever. Well, that's on one paper, on one set of settings, on one printer that they've managed to achieve this magic number. What's much more useful is to look at the black point in the profile. So what's the max black in the profile? Because those are always on the L value scale. So on the L scale, 0 is pure black and 100 is pure white. And in printing, we can never do 0 to 100. So for instance, the Juniper on the P5000, I think is 3 to 96. So that's our scale. And then the second layer to that is on a lot of the newer matte paper profiles, we've been using polarized readings. So the profile will say that the gamut is similar to a photo black paper, except that the instrument can see those extremely dark shadow gradations, but with our eyes, we can't see them. So it's, and this is a really long answer to, I think, probably what you hoped was a short question, but what you mainly need to do, number one, is make some test prints on your printer. If you have the software to do so, you can evaluate the profiles and look at the white point and the black point and see what has the largest gamut. Generally, in the Moab range, the museum rag is going to give you the largest gamut and kind of the best black point, and Entrada rag textured will be a very close second. So I would say whether you want a smooth finish or a slightly textured, you're looking at the museum rag or the Entrada textured. And if you have more questions about that, feel free to email me and we can discuss that more in depth.
So someone has a Canon Image Prograph Pro 2000 and is using Juniper Baryta rag. He finds that his dark areas of the print will become a total black mess. Nothing he seems to do with Print Studio Pro or Lightroom seems to help. And he's using the proper profiles.
So my guess is that this person is printing with relative colorimetric rendering. And if you're using relative colorimetric in Print Studio Pro, there is no ability to turn on black point compensation. And so all of your shadow tones will not be adapted to match the black point in the profile. So if you're printing out of Print Studio Pro, you need to choose perceptual rendering, and it should clear that up. I'd say do a test print with perceptual rendering and see if that solves it, because that's the one big challenge with Print Studio Pro is you cannot choose black point compensation with relative colorimetric rendering. And yes, your shadows do come out all black and you wonder what's gone wrong. I've made that mistake myself.
So someone is looking for surface protection for Slick Rock Pearl. If they can't use Desert Varnish, they're trying to avoid using framing. Is there anything else that might protect that surface?
The best thing you can do is use a thin UV laminate film. That's hard to do yourself. I think you can use some of the spray-on or roll-on coatings we talked about in the opening regarding canvas, but I have no experience doing that. And so it would be a proceed at your own risk kind of thing. Another good strategy is to call up, if there's a frame shop close by that you've worked with, they might have some ideas. But the challenge, especially with the two Slick Rock papers, is those are very hydrophilic coatings. You get any liquid near them and they suck it in and hold on to it. So any liquid coating is probably going to present a challenge and be kind of unevenly absorbed in the surface. So I would say some sort of a thin UV laminate is going to be your best bet for longer term prints without glazing. The other thing that you can do that is definitely more of a print shop thing than an at-home thing is to laminate that image to a thin or a thick piece of plexiglass. and display it that way. And that does give you the archivability. Obviously, it's then mounted to glass. So if you're trying to totally avoid glass, that's a non-starter. But yeah, the UV laminate is going to be, even if it's just the thin film, is going to be the best way to protect those without glazing.
We have someone using a Canon Pro 100. They've downloaded the profile for the Slick Rock Metallic. However, when I select the profile, my images come out darker than they should. When I select Manage by Printer, the image comes out as it displays on my monitor. What am I doing wrong?
Was that Slick Rock Silver or Slick Rock Pearl?
They don't specify. It sounds like it's the silver.
I think it's the silver. So the silver will often appear much darker when you print it because it's not a white base paper on that L scale that we touched on earlier. The Slick Rock Silver, the base color is about L60. So you've lost a huge amount of white range. And the trick to evaluating silver prints is that you need to look at that print with a fair amount of light. So if you're going to display that, in your home somewhere, you're going to want to make sure that it's in an area that's either well lit from artificial light, or you don't want to wash it directly in sunlight, but in a brighter room. So I'm guessing that's the challenge here, is you just need more evaluation light with the print. If you say printer manages colors and you make that print and it appears brighter, it's probably mixing the inks differently, and I'm guessing that it's not as color accurate, but it may appear a little brighter because a profile doesn't really change the brightness of the file. Profile is just for color accuracy. But if you're, depending on if your monitor is calibrated or not, that will have a big difference on the apparent brightness of the print versus the screen. And then especially with the Slick Rock Silver, making sure that you properly illuminate those prints to really see what's on the paper, because the light has to go through the ink, reflect off the base of the paper, and come back to you before you can really see the nuances of that sheet.
So he's actually using the Pearl. Is that going to be the same recommendation?
The Pearl's pretty white. So again, go back to, is your monitor calibrated? And when you calibrated it, did you do the specific brightness setting? And then making sure that you're evaluating those two prints under the same light source.
What is the best program for upsizing a file to make a larger print?
Depends on how much upsizing you need to do. The easiest thing you can do is sort of the 10% stair step in Photoshop. What you don't want to do is you don't want to take a file that, say, you want to double it in size and say, oh, boom, 300%, here's my result. Because it's going to have to do so much interpolation on those pixels that it's not going to turn out well. So the best thing to do, let's see, if you go to image, I don't know if you see the menus or not. Desktop one, here we go. All right, so if you're in Photoshop and you go to image and then image size, the easiest, quickest way to do this is to go to percent and keep your width and your height locked, and then just do it in 10% at a time. So you're going to do 110% and okay, and then you're going to do the same thing again, image size, 110%. And you're going to repeat that process until you get up to the size that you need. So that's kind of the manual, easier way to do it. If you're looking for a specific piece of software, I'm trying to remember, it used to be Genuine Fractals was what we all used, and then they were purchased by another company. And I'm trying to see, I know I have the software, but I don't remember what it's called. Probably somebody, On One Photo, that was it. So On One Photo purchased that technology and has built it into their On One Photo RAW. And that is a program that can do significant resizing. And I have used that a few times when we have small images that need to be printed quite large. And it does a pretty good job. Now, granted, the better base file you have, the better that enlargement's going to be. Or if you have the ability going back and redoing your raw file and then interpolating off the raw file is always the best, because then the software is looking at all the original data, can make those decisions. So if you can go back and re-edit the raw and do the size increase straight out of the raw converter, that's always going to be preferable to doing the stair-step interpolation in Photoshop or something in On1.
Okay. I have an Epson SC7000. I need a paper for extreme brilliant colors, not a pure glossy, but close to it. Any suggestions?
Well, the Juniper is going to have, a slightly warm white point that we talked about, but it is going to be probably the largest gamut paper. And then the second to that would be the Exhibition Luster, which is going to be more of a classic bright white, heavyweight luster paper. So if you're looking for a real photorealistic kind of classic lab look, it'd probably be more the luster. But for a darkroom fiber paper classic photo look, you'd want the Juniper.
Do you by any chance know if the Canon Pro 200 and Pro 300 have fixed the 30mm margin restriction on the paper media?
Both of them have. All the new Canons let you print borderless on finer media settings.
Great.
And we've got some really good conversation here in the chat. Thanks to George and Jim for jumping in. They're good resources of mine as well. And looks like we have some good recommendations on upscaling and varnishes and all sorts of other things. So thanks everybody for pitching in there, and it's a great conversation.
So someone has the Epson SC P800 and primarily uses the Epson cold press and hot press bright for a matte paper and the Epson Legacy Baryta for their luster glossy paper. What would you recommend as an alternative or an improvement to their current papers? So
hot press is smooth and cold press is textured. And the Legacy Baryta is a Baryta. So hot press, I would say and that's hot press bright. So you'd say maybe the Entrada Rag Bright. Or I would say, if you don't mind it to be just a little warmer, try that Somerset Museum rag. It's a gorgeous paper. It's definitely gonna be noticeably better than the hot press. Cold press, we don't have a super textured paper in the Moab lineup. We have the Entrada Rag textured, but that's a lighter texture. So I would actually point you over to the Canson edition etching, or if you want a lot of texture, the Aquarelle rag. Again, both of those have really good coatings, and I think will also outshine your Epson papers. And then the Legacy Baryta, I would try the Juniper. Again, it's going to be a little bit warmer, but typically when you don't have it in a lineup with a bunch of other papers, you don't necessarily notice. Or another one that's a bit whiter, but also a really nice heavyweight, high quality Baryta is the Canson Baryta Prestige. So all those would be good recommendations. So that was the Moab Somerset Museum rag, the Entrada textured, or the Canson Baryta Prestige edition etching Aquarelle rag.
Which is the least glossy of our glossy papers?
Well, we technically in the Moab line only have one glossy paper, which is the Slick Rock Metallic Pearl, which is not a super high gloss. And then there's the Exhibition Luster, which is a luster, and then the Juniper, which is kind of a semi-gloss Baryta. So I guess the least reflective would be the Juniper. The other two being a classic luster, and then not quite, the Pearl is a not quite glossy white-based paper. If that sort of answers the question.
Yeah, I don't think we have a glossy paper. I think the closest would be the metallic Pearl, but otherwise then a slight shine would be the luster or the Juniper, I would think.
And I just saw Paul here says, I need to replace my Canon Pro 9500 Is the Pro 300 a good choice? I think the Pro 300 is a great choice. We've had it here for testing for a couple of months, and it produces really great images, and they've added a lot of nice features to it. Can the pigment inks be used on luster and glossy? Absolutely. Pigment inks are sort of the Swiss Army knife of inks. You can use them on any photo paper. The difference is that pigment inks are optimized for a little more saturation on glossy papers and for faster printing. So there's no downside to pigment inks. I would absolutely recommend those to anybody, looking to invest in a photo printer, because even if you say now, I'm more of a luster Baryta person, I'm not really big into the fine art papers or whatever else. Well, down the road, you might kind of discover the cotton papers and really fall in love with them, and you're going to get better prints with pigment ink versus the dye ink.
So someone is printing black and white from a negative scan. To get the right looking print, I need to go to Cmyk and then I get a color cast. Any suggestions?
Yeah, Cmyk is designed for offset press and rip software and that sort of thing. I don't recommend working in Cmyk with photography that you're going to print yourself, because an inkjet printer, any inkjet printer, is based on RGB. So if you're trying to print a Cmyk file, it's going to go through a lot of color conversion to come out as RGB. So I would take your, scan into either RGB or into gray gamma, depending on what works better for your editing, and then print those files, normally as gray gamma or as RGB files, depending on what gives you the best output. And again, black and white, digital black and white is another one of those things where there's a lot of opinion and a lot of advice. Do a little research, do a little reading, but then figure out what works for you the best. Some people swear by Epson's advanced black and white being better than any custom color profile. I like the color profile route because the color profile knows the exact black and white point of the paper that you're printing on. And so I think it does a better job of optimizing the contrast range and the detail without sacrificing neutrality. So again, those are all different things, but definitely scan into and edit in an RGB or a gray gamma file, not a Cmyk file, unless you're printing for books, and then that's something totally different.
So we get this question, I think, every single webinar that we do, and that's for the test print that you showed, which we probably should maybe link it on our website, but I'm not sure we're allowed to. But if anyone has that link to the test print.
It's an old Outback photo download link. Let me see if I have it.
And I know people have put it in the chat before, so if anyone has that, please put it in the chat. But we get that question all the time.
And folks have sent it to me. I don't think I have it for quick deployment here. But
yeah, we'll make sure we have that on hand for the next time, because we get that question all the time.
I'm sure someone will pop up and find it. Hit me with another one. I'll see if I can find it.
Does Lightroom automatically apply black point compensation when selecting relative intent?
Yes, it does. Here we go. I found it.
So we'll just put that in the chat so you can grab the link to that. So someone wants to replace their Epson 3880 with a Pigment Ink printer. Any suggestions?
I love the 3880. The one we have here is still running, and I'm gonna be very sad and give it a full backyard funeral when that thing finally dies. It is gonna depend on if you want to go to a Canon printer or if you want to stay with Epson. If you want to stay with Epson, it's going to be the P900 to keep that 17-inch platen. If it's a Canon, you're going to go for the Pro 1000. They're about the same price to purchase. I haven't broken down the cost per ink on the volume, so you might want to look at that. Lately, Epson has been charging a little more for their ink, so the Pro 1000 might be one to look at. The Pro 1000 gives you Canon's print software, which is a nice alternative if you want kind of an all-in-one workflow in one application. It used to be a big difference was that the Epson would make you switch the matte black and the photo black. They've gotten rid of that finally, which is fantastic. So now you don't have to do all your matte prints and then all your glossy prints. I think output wise, they're extremely similar. So it's going to come down to, cost of ownership, customer service. Obviously, Canon support is on the East Coast of the US. Epson support is worldwide based, and can be a little tougher to get good advice from, in my experience. So, and also right now, the Epson printers, I don't know if they're back in stock yet, but I know, as with so many places, they've had a lot of supply issues this year. So the Canons may be in stock and the Epsons may not be in stock. But again, as always, if you live close enough to a camera store to pay them a visit and they have both on display, again, take some paper and make a couple of prints on both of them side to side and evaluate them, because that's always going to be your best bet to see, hey, does this make a difference for my work? Do I like the workflow? Does it fit on the shelf? All these other sort of intrinsic things. It's kind of the way we choose a camera, right? There's 6 cameras with the same specs, but some of them you pick up and it fits into your hand and you know where the controls are, and some other cameras you pick up and it's like learning a different language.
So you're getting called out here a little bit. 2 months ago, you said you would in due time make custom profiles for Canon AM1X.
Custom media settings, yes.
Did you do it?
Those are still on the docket. We've been doing a lot of work with the new Canson Arch papers that are launching next month and that sort of thing. So it's mainly been a time deficit. With everybody being at home in the past year, I think everybody's printing a lot more. So we've had a lot more unexpected work kind of come up and staying current on that. So I haven't forgotten. Fortunately, I hope I didn't promise a timeline back then, but yes, they are on the whiteboard of to-dos, and they will get done sooner than later. It's the best I can promise.
I resize my image in Photoshop to the print size and the printer resolution I will send to my Canon Pro 1000. I sharpen after resizing before printing. Is this the correct workflow to get the most accurate print?
It sounds like it. I would absolutely do any sharpening after resizing. The question is it essential that you resize the image? So let's say your original file is at 220 pixels. Are you resizing it up to 300 to make the print? And have you done a side-by-side comparison at the same apparent size to see if it makes a big difference? Because again, the software has gotten good enough that I think absolute resizing to a specific resolution is less important than it used to be, and maybe can introduce some other issues. So sounds like your workflow is correct, but just in case, test and see kind of what the lowest resolution is that you can print at that still looks good, and is there a kind of a cost benefit to resizing that file?
I have an older Color Monkey display profile. Would there be a benefit from getting the newer i1 Studio by X-Rite?
Depends on how old it is. So if your monitor calibrator is, 6 or 7 years old, it's probably kind of out of calibration itself. Those sensors do age over time. They're not museum pieces. So the only big reason is if that calibrator is getting pretty old, a new one may be more accurate. And you'd really notice that if you do a calibration and it's not quite right, and you double check it and it's still not quite right, there's a good chance that sensor is getting kind of old. Other than that, no, as I often talk about on monitor calibrators, whether you buy the i1 Display Studio, I think for $170-ish, or you go out and buy the i1 Pro 3 for $1,700, they're going to give you the same monitor profile. You're not going to get a huge benefit by spending a bunch more money. So an inexpensive monitor calibrator gives you, funds to spend on paper and ink and new lenses and all that kind of stuff, instead of a monitor calibrator that's not going to make an appreciable difference in your editing.
So we are kind of running out of time. I think we can try to get through a few more because we still have a lot of questions. But we are going to start doing these, I think, monthly. So just stay updated for when we have our next one. It'll probably be beginning of April, I would say. And you can always email us with questions too. So feel free to do that.
I'll put everybody sign me up for all the spam lists out there.
All right, while I do that, I'm going to read you this next question. Do you recommend setting the print resolution to the printer's native resolution when printing? For
Yeah,
example,
so we
okay.
had a long chat about this maybe 20 minutes ago. And the short answer is that I haven't seen a big advantage to doing that, especially if your image is a higher resolution. So if you have a high res file and you're going to print it out smaller than what the native resolution would be. So if it's a 12 by 18 at 360 pixels and you're making an 8 by 10, I haven't seen any advantage in downresing the file. And then if it's smaller and you're printing it larger, again, like I just mentioned to the other person who asked, make a small test and see what that image looks like. And by a small test, what I mean is if your file is sized to 11 by 14, you can put a piece of 5 by 7 paper in the printer and print it, and then tell the software not to scale the image. So you're just printing a little section of the bigger image. And when you print that section, make sure to move it around so it's the area of the image with the most detail or the most transitions or the biggest gradient, or so you can really see, most of an image we're not worried about when we print it, but hair, eyes, trees in a landscape, grass, things like that if there's something wrong, it's really going to fall apart and you're going to notice. Do a test print and see how it looks, because there are very scientific ways to do things and there are sort of less detailed ways to do it. But in addition to that, as printers and software evolves, some of the old things that were hard and fast rules aren't hard and fast rules before, because we've overcome the Achilles heel of the mathematics or the processing speed or things like that to work with that image data.
So this is a question that we also get often. Does Moab make paper, or do you buy it from different mills made to your specifications?
So Moab does not own a mill. Moab is part of Legion Paper, which is a big art paper distributor and importer, and a lot of the papers are specifically made for us. So we spec the base, we spec the coating, we do the development and the testing, and then it becomes one of our photo papers. So we don't sort of shop around for the best thing and then that's what's available under the brand. We're not selling stuff sort of as private label, meaning that the Entrada 190 that you bought 6 years ago is going to be the same as the Entrada 190 that you buy now. We get that paper specifically manufactured for us, and it's a consistent product start to finish, just like your printer ink that is a very specific formula that never changes, so your colors always come out accurately. But yeah, we're not sort of a relabeler of other papers. We're specifically work with the mills to create the papers that we offer.
Okay, I think we'll close out with that question. So if any of your questions did not get answered, feel free to email us, or we're going to be doing a ton more of these. We're also going to be putting some more like tips and tricks on social media, so follow us on social media, and we'll be doing this again in April. So we'll send out an email when the link is ready to register. And thanks everyone for joining this webinar.
And I think our next webinar is in a couple weeks, and we're going to do black and white. Is that our?
Yeah, we're going to do black and white.
Yeah, Jim Graham and I are going to put that together. So kind of half editing and half printing. So I know a lot of people have asked for that. So that's our next production.
Yes. And if anyone has suggestions on something that you're really interested in that you want a full webinar on, please let us know so that we can add that to the list. It's more for you to learn. So let us know what you want to learn.
Absolutely. And thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.